feel a different intensity with this. We are anyway with this administration, particularly with business leaders. I know that's like super macro, and we're going to talk about IP and patents, but just to level set, I just think we need to realize the space that we're operating in and how many other just unbelievably consequential issues are moving at the same time. And that's all competing for the attention that's going to come when Howard Lutnick, who's going to have his hearing this week, gets confirmed, and there's so many officials who are going to work with and for him, and they're just all operating in that space at, I think, just Mach 10. So.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Chris. Dave, your initial thoughts.
Yeah, so building on that, what I would tell you, Gene, is that in times when things get chaotic, it's really important to have a good compass and some good waypoints to navigate from. And we, the IP community, really need that right now. So I would tell you there are some things that aren't going to change between now and tomorrow, or now and next week, or now and next month, or even probably now and next year. One of them is we need to stand behind the PTO, right? We need to be all on team PTO. And that means really basic things like fee diversion. The last thing in the world we want is for that to somehow creep back into the world. That means really basic things like dealing with backlogs and pendency. Because if the PTO can't get that back under control, it's really not going to be able to do anything else, right? Because that becomes the elephant in every room if the agency isn't able to just practice or to process its workload. So those things won't change. The other thing that won't change, coming into focus with this panel and just the slightly larger legislative context, is it won't change that we need PTAB reform. That's the PREVAIL Act. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail. It won't change that we will need injunctive reform, right? That's the Restore Act. We're going to get that. We hope we're going to get that reintroduced along with PREVAIL. And it won't change that we need to get 101 straightened out, and that's PERA, right? So we've got to stay focused, support the PTO, get important pro-innovator, necessary legislation reintroduced, advanced through Congress, and passed into law. Those are the things we need to do. And then one other comment, and I'll stop, is that, as Chris mentioned, we've got some new senior appointees probably coming in very soon. Howard Lutnick, Secretary of Commerce. You've already got Elon Musk has been mentioned. For the first time in my recollection, we've got people coming in at cabinet and call it uber cabinet levels who at least think they know something about patents and the patent system. And that is going to create a very different dialogue and dynamic than we've really ever seen before in my life. I don't remember when there's ever been a Secretary of Commerce who would claim to know anything about patents, or really anyone else at the top of the administration. So we're going to have some things that are badly mistaken to deal with and have to try and help guide those. We're going to have some things that are probably really good to deal with, and we're going to have to help amplify those. So it's going to be a big challenge, and that's why I feel like one thing for sure, we need to be on Team PTO, and we need to be on our reform agenda.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Judge, your initial thoughts.
Well, it's very hard to make predictions, so I won't try to do that. Let me just lay a bit of a baseline, because soon I'm going to be very critical of some aspects of the PTAB. But I want to be clear as the baseline that I support the AIA. It was necessary. Overall, it was very good. It was implemented as well as could be, given some of the design defects embedded in the IPR proceedings in the statute itself. I'm in favor of the PTAB. I think overall it's doing a very good job, a very necessary job. And I think that the overall situation of the country for our innovation engine is that the courts unintentionally, unwittingly, unnecessarily have created a big mess. And the patent profession is going to have to rescue the country's innovation machine by influencing Congress, by correcting errant initial assumptions by incoming powers. So it's really on the shoulders of the patent community, all of you, to help straighten out this considerable series of messes. I think it's possible. I think it'll happen. It won't be easy, and it won't happen unless everybody gets quite involved, including in ways that may be uncomfortable. For example, there's going to have to be a lot of lobbying on Capitol Hill to educate staffers and members about these reforms that Dave Kapos has mentioned. I support them all 1,000%, and I would even add a few more, but I won't go into that right now. But it's a time of tremendous opportunity, but it's also a time of tremendous danger. And to make sure the outcome is right is going to take everybody to get involved in a very constructive and kind of brave way. So I hope we will.
Okay, so I may make just some very quick opening remarks myself. And one of the things, and maybe I'll invite you all to comment on this, because I think this may pull the pin on the grenade and roll it into the, into the mix here. It occurred to me just yesterday, as we were, after our pre-call last week, we were talking about the importance of the backlog, and Dave, you've already mentioned that, and I almost can't believe I'm about to say this because of so much that I have written in the past about what a atrocity having a million plus backlog is, and I think we're looking at much more than any backlog even you walked into, Dave. But what difference does it make? And I say what difference does it make is because patents in the U.S. I don't think are worth very much anymore. And that's a sad commentary for a whole host of reasons. Now, I don't know where that goes. I do hope that if, Koch and whoever winds up being the director can fix this whole system from top to bottom. But if we can't fix the system from top to bottom, the least of our worry is going to be having a backlog where people can't get patents. Because frankly, I would think as a patent owner or in-house person, I would be perfectly fine in a whole lot of areas having the patent office take however long they need to take, and I'll take my term on the back end, and maybe we'll have PERA, maybe we'll have PREVAIL, maybe we'll have Restore by that point in time. And I think that's a very sad commentary. But where to begin now here to dive in? I mean, maybe we can just very quickly, we all expect PERA, or PREVAIL rather, will be reintroduced, and it'll be reintroduced substantially where it left off, right, Chris?
Yeah, I think I think so. We've where it left off end of last year, December, it passed Senate Judiciary Committee 11-10. It went through some fits and starts, and we can talk about those in an amendment process in which Senator Cruz had this idea of kind of allowing for this opt-out of sorts for small inventors, so a lot of pressure. Mm-hmm. I think that remains in the room for that discussion, primarily coming from the small inventor community, who is, a lot of us who've worked with them, would like to see PTAB go away in its entirety. Change of leadership, obviously, in the Senate on the Judiciary Committee at the IP subcommittee level, with Senator Tillis having the gavel, and now Senator Schiff from California being the ranking member. Senator Coons still on the subcommittee, but in a not in a I would say an overt leadership role, more as a subtle leadership role. So yeah, I think that bill gets reintroduced probably in the February-March timeframe. I mean, I really do think staff are they're going flat out on confirmations and just really, kind of figuring out some kind of starting points at this point. So yeah, I think we get with PREVAIL reintroduced. I think Restore gets reintroduced. Restore's a pretty simple bill. I don't know that that's going to needs or could even change very much, the injunctive relief provision. So yeah, and then I think the education curve. And it picks up with a lot of members, but it's going to start off with a lot of new faces and names. I will say one thing that I think could be a real game changer that we didn't see over the last 4 years is if the administration were to lean in heavily and substantively into one or all of those pieces of legislation. I mean, I really think that's kind of a missing link in the continuum, and it changes the dynamic for a lot of members, particularly Republicans, if the administration is providing technical support, is providing some guidance, really has kind of a an understood support for one or all of those pieces of legislation. That didn't exist over the last 4 years, but that could change things significantly, I think.
Yeah, I would go even a little further to say I think it's a total game changer if at the commerce level, if the Secretary of Commerce is in there working with members on both sides of the aisle to get that legislation done.
Mm-hmm. So, so Dave, can you give us an idea, like what would it mean in your estimation? I mean, you were there when like the major change to the patent system happened, and I think the White House was pretty behind that as it was going on. Can you talk a little bit about that dynamic and what that means to getting things across the finish line?
Yeah, Gene, I think it was the difference between failure and success, quite frankly, because at any level sub-cabinet, so at the PTO director level, you can be in there, as Chris says, you're providing technical input and you're helping and you're meeting with members and talking to them about what works and what doesn't work and trying to add substance. But what it really takes, and what happened was when the Secretary of Commerce calls together the chair and the ranking member of the committee and has them over in his fifth floor office at the Department of Commerce at 7:30 in the morning with a brilliant fire burning in the fireplace and that 750-gallon fish tank with fish swimming around in it and staff coming in with delicious food, right, and a briefing, that's what makes a difference. And that's exactly what happened. And then when the president makes not 20 calls, but 1 or 2 calls, right, in support, that's what it takes to get legislation passed. And that's what happened for the AIA, and I'm hoping that's what can happen again now.
In your estimation, based on what you see on the ground, what do you think the odds are?
I think they're much better now, and I am optimistic because it's great legislation. It's pro-innovation. It's had a lot of vetting. All 3 bills have had a lot of good vetting, and we've got leadership that coming in that I think does understand the patent system in a business-like way, and so I'm super optimistic that with help from this community, these bills can move.
And I would argue it's very consistent with where the first Trump term was, right? We talked about Sotera and Fintiv and lots of things in other previous panels, but I mean, I think you can draw direct parallels, right? I mean, it puts in statute many of the positions that the Trump administration took in its first 4 years.
Judge.
Gene, I think there's a serious challenge here of timing. Chris correctly emphasized the tremendous heavy load on the Congress, just on confirmations, much less normal legislation. And frankly, the 3 bills that Chris and Dave and I have all worked so hard to advance are not at the top of the priority list of anybody in the House or the Senate. And most staffers are not well versed about these things. And so I think these bills will ultimately pass because they're needed and because they will correct serious problems that are hurting the pace of innovation. But the biggest timing problem of all is not the slowness of the legislative process and the distraction of people at high levels of government. The biggest problem is China is advancing a mile a minute on every advanced technology of the 21st century. And we are not anymore. We did for a long time, and then for a while we were maybe running about even on average. And I think now in many areas we're starting to lose ground, and China's advancing fast. So I think we have a race on our hands with China, but also other economic rivals. Europe is not holding still. Europe has this new unified patent court, which I think is terrific. It's got specialist judges. It's got courts at all levels. It's got extremely talented people. It's moving very fast. It's way faster and way cheaper than our courts are, and it's going to help European innovation a lot, and they deserve credit for doing what they needed to do, and we should be hard at work doing what we need to do, and there's a lot we need to do. Our system is not a system. If you think of the different players, there's no complete integration between what the examiners do, what the PTAB does, what the district courts do, what the International Trade Commission does, and what the Federal Circuit does. It's all a helter-skelter puzzle pieces where the pieces don't fit together, don't integrate. So what's the result of that? Low predictability, low reliability. That's an innovation-killing reality. And we have to change that. The system is supposed to work to incentivize investment and business decision-making as well as just innovation in the abstract. But it can't do that when it's so unreliable, so unpredictable, so slow, so expensive, and all the other defects we know about. So we're in a race with China, we're in a race with ourselves, and we're going to need leadership at every level. I am a little optimistic about the long run because there are a dozen or so legislators who are very well versed in these issues and providing terrific leadership, and they pretty much are at the leadership positions of the two IP subcommittees. So we've got an environment we can expect to make progress in, even if it will be difficult. The problem is the opposition will be ferocious. It's already been ferocious, and it'll continue to be ferocious. So that means people need to be able to take some punches, to be able to, use some capital, to take some risks. Everybody, people in the Commerce Department, the White House, and in the Congress, and I hope they will be, because I think, frankly, the whole future of the country is what's at stake here.
Okay. So that lays a lot on the ground. The one thing that we haven't put on the table, return to the office. And there's some conflicting information that's out there on LinkedIn, for example, with people taking screenshots of emails going back and forth. And then there was a memo I read from the Department of Commerce, and it said, to the extent practicable, everybody should return to the office. But if there's a collective bargaining agreement in place, honor the collective bargaining agreement. And then there was a clause at the end of that memo from Commerce: this does not apply to the Patent Office or to one section of NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which makes people wonder whether, is that because we want to consider that, or is there something else going on there? So there's a lot more uncertainty than there is certainty. But so the examiners on both the patent and trademark side seem like they're set because of the collective bargaining agreement Director Vidal entered into the week before. She negotiated it, but I guess it was Acting Director Derek Brent signed it. But that leaves the PTAB judges and the SPEs a little bit in limbo, perhaps. It seems like they're okay at the moment. The memo said it doesn't apply to the Patent Office, but there does seem to be this push. And I wonder what's going to happen. I think a lot of folks in the PTAB, they're all over the place. I think if they had to return to the office, they would probably just quit. I think if they quit, then it would call into question the ability for the office to continue to do the same number of IPRs, for example. PGRs sort of is a rounding error in this whole thing, but IPRs, and still hit the 12 months. And even if you extended it more routinely to 18 months, which you can do, you'd still have trouble doing 1,400 of these if enough of the PTAB judges decided to quit. So I've been thinking about that, and I wonder whether that would be the worst thing in the world if there was a little bit more discernment on the institution front, which I think would have to happen. But I'd like to get your take on this, any of you, if you have any thoughts on what this might mean. Judge, it looks like you're...
Well, I think the front end is the place to concentrate on. Final written decisions are well written, very thorough, almost always affirmed. Even when they're not affirmed, they're not reversed. They just remand and ask the PTAB to take a little further look at it in light of whatever guidance is provided. But the front end is the problem. When the statute was passed in 2011, the idea was that the PTAB was going to provide an alternative to expensive district court litigation, that the result would be faster and cheaper. In a case where the patent is really a dog and it's going to go down at the PTAB, that can be true because then the district court case disappears. But in closer cases, instead of being an alternative to district court, it just becomes a prelude. So now we add cost and delay and uncertainty to a system already plagued by those three things. So I think the front end is going to have to be managed very skillfully and I think boldly. And when the statute was passed, Dave can correct me if I misstate this inadvertently, but Congress had the idea that at least at the beginning there might have to be some control of the influx, because meeting the one-year deadline and doing a competent job was important too. And I remember, I think accurately, that they estimated that there'd be about 400 cases a year. So we now know it's 12, 13, 1,400 cases a year. And it's admirable that the board has met the one-year deadline, I think without a single exception. But if a lot of board members quit because of office policy or whatever, that's going to be a big problem. And even if they don't, for the system to work right, it shouldn't be the fact that in every major case there's an IPR before there's a district court invalidity proceeding. That's just crazy. That's the opposite of efficiency. Do it twice.
And it would be one thing if it was do it twice, but we have a system where we do it like 3 or 4 times. We have a lot of these cases, they're at the PTAB, they're at one, if not more than one district court, and they're at the ITC. And then they're also simultaneously going on overseas. And I talked a long time ago to my longtime friend, Brad Close, is in the audience. I'm like, there's a way, even with patents as weak as they are today, that you as a patent owner can win. And we kind of just did a back-of-the-envelope calculation, and it would require, I think we came out to about a $30 million budget. If you have a $30 million budget, you have... That was 5 years ago before inflation.
A lot of inflation.
Because a lot of inflation, because it's you need to have an ITC, you need to be in a district court, at least hopefully one that is going to be somewhat favorable, maybe requiring a couple lawsuits to be filed. You got to prepare for the PTAB, and you probably got to be, depending upon the patent and issue, in Germany or maybe Brazil. And you maybe don't have a Brazil assets in Brazil, but you need this real full court press. And if you can bring that full court press to bear, you've got a chance to get some of the more recalcitrant predatory infringers to the table.
Yeah, but Gene, here's the problem. Google has that kind of budget and can afford that kind of system. But Google is an exceptional company in size and wealth and various other ways. The average innovative company cannot afford millions and millions and millions to try to enforce a patent. And small business and middle-sized business employs vastly more American workers than the giants in Silicon Valley or elsewhere. And there's a lot of evidence that many of the best technological breakthroughs are done by these smaller players, the startups, the small and middle-sized entities, and they're being totally crushed in the system we have now. They may be our best asset, and we're killing them off.
Right. Yeah. Well, even if it's only the $30 million that we calculated on the back of the envelope, and no inflation, how much money do you have to have at stake to make putting $30 million at risk, still not knowing whether, like, the Apples of the world, for example, will take a license?
And to make it, to amplify that problem, most of the time, that money's not yours in the first place,
No.
right? You're venture funded,
Right.
or you've got litigation financing of some shape, right? So you're burning cash, and the big companies obviously know that. I mean, I will say this. I mean, I don't know if it's a silver lining to everything you just articulated, Gene, but I do think, and Dave, you kind of touched on this, I think there is a fundamental awareness of that dynamic across the board on Capitol Hill, right? I mean, particularly with
And that's new, right? That's fairly new with last year or two?
I'd say it goes further back than the last year or two. I think it's grown and spread out and is continuing to grow. And we do a lot of meetings on the Hill, and the best, most convincing thing you can present to a member of Congress, in my opinion, or a staffer or an administration official, is that case study, and is that actual company, that CEO who's been through it, or that general counsel of an innovative small company that's probably $200 or $300 million of venture funding on their way, a decade in maybe, and they've been through this, right? I mean, I've you'll get challenged on things around the edges. I think, standing. Can we tweak something about standing, or, are there things that we need to do to make sure that we kind of, questions about PREVAIL or whatever. But I mean, you don't get pushback, or I've not felt a lot of recent substantive and effective pushback to that basic premise where someone will challenge and say, nah, that's not right. It's working great for those guys. Right now, the startups, I mean, it's all humming. I mean, you will see, look, we've got a lot of startups. There's a lot of venture money going into different places. And to that, we can point to statistics and say, yeah, a lot of it's going into, kind of fast-moving apps, software. I don't think as a country we're investing type of venture capital or attracting into the startups that are doing these things in areas like cybersecurity, core wireless, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, medical devices, right? I mean, those are super patent intensive. They're very expensive things to do, and they tend to be, at least the ones we work with, the types of companies that find themselves all too frequently in that type of kind of progression you just articulated, Gene. And that leads you to PREVAIL. Like, what's the solution? You get the ask from a member of Congress. Like, okay, I believe what you're telling me. That seems terrible, and we need to fix it. What do we do? And as Dave said, I think we're now at a place where we've got several mature pieces of legislation, and hopefully an administration partner and a growing cohort of members on the Hill that'll work with us and try to put something in statute, because I do think that, as earlier panels said, I mean, that avoids this toggling, right? The back and forth, like this administration, that administration. Put something in statute so the companies that are trying to invent things and the people that they're asking money from can make some educated decisions about how to spend, a decade of their life and several $100 million, because we're losing things along the way.
Hey, Gene, just before we go too far off of your return to the office point, I agree that the Commerce memo is helpful. Hopefully that'll hold. It, on its face, helps the whole PTO. How long that will help the PTAB remains to be seen, so we should all watch that. I would tell you that's another reason why this community needs to be active now in helping the new appointees at the Commerce level, et cetera, to understand, senators to understand, there's a lot going on in the PTO, and it's not just the examiners who need to be protected. They certainly do, but it's also the PTAB. But even when you get past the memo that you mentioned and the issue of return to the office, there's another problem, which is the hiring freeze. And that, to my knowledge, has not exempted the PTO. So now we're in a world in which the agency, again, I'm on this, we all need to be on Team PTO, and we need to give it the backing and the cover that it's going to require to get on top of the basic workload. And that starts with hiring examiners. I mean, there are a number of things, but one thing is hiring examiners. And if the agency can't do that, it's going to be, in the end, catching a falling knife, and is really going to struggle.
So what would you do? I mean, obviously, if we could get PERA, PREVAIL, and Restore, things would change, I think, pretty significantly, pretty quickly thereafter. At least a lot of these issues that have plagued patent owners would at least need to be relitigated and reconsidered moving forward. But we've seen this. It feels sometimes like this is Charlie Brown and Lucy with the football. We've been going at this I think now this will be 9 years, right? This will be the fifth Congress that some of these things have been kicking around. Much more seriously over the last couple Congresses, and much more seriously last Congress for sure. But I don't think we can put all our eggs in that basket as much as we might like. We need to, I think, try and do some stuff at the PTO. What would you do? What would you try and do to move this along, or change the needle, or move the needle?
Well, you've already mentioned one thing, Gina, I think is exactly right, is it's an opportunity for the PTAB, to use Judge Michel's framing, to be bold about starting to filter things at the front end more. If they're not going to have the resources they need to take on 1,400 cases, it's an opportunity to say, look, we're going to be a little more discriminating here. We have the latitude to do that. So that would be one thing. The second thing, in terms of the core and the examiners, there's a lot that goes into retention and preventing or addressing the sources of attrition early examiner attrition, particularly examiners who've been around the agency only a few years and are just coming up the productivity curve. So in an era when you're limited on hiring, you got to also address the attrition issue and try and bring that under control, right? And then sort of the last thing is looking for process improvements that you can implement. And I'll give you one example that was set up in the AIA, which is the concept of Track 3. Remember, Track 1 got created by the AIA, so if you need to get a patent in less than a year, you can do that, pay some money, the office will examine it quickly. We also set up the framework then for a Track 3, which is to say deferred examination. If you don't need a patent right away, and many don't, including in the biopharma industry, you can actually say, I'm going to pay the agency, I'm going to accept 18-month publication so the prior art is out there. I don't need this thing to be examined yet. I'll come back to you in the, whatever it is, 28-month statutory period and tell you when I need it to be examined. What, at least when I was at the PTO, what the data showed was that somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of those applications would fall out. So it's a little bit like the PTAB becoming more discerning, right? Now you've got applicants paying money, so it's productive and, if you will, profitable for the agency to get the applications in, publish them so they become prior art to the world. 20% of those never get examined, they just get dropped. They don't create patents. Examiners don't have to spin their wheels on something that's unimportant. And you've just essentially liberated 20% of your resource. So that kind of approach, which was set up a long time ago. The only reason we didn't implement it is because we didn't have the money at the time to implement it. Now the PTO does have the money to implement it. So I would say there are a series of productivity moves and workforce retention moves that are going to need to be prioritized in order to keep people in the door, get them to be more productive and pleased about their work, and to ensure that that process is improved so that the agency is using its time more effectively.
And if the timing predictions that I would hazard a guess about actually are realistic, we may be waiting several years before we get these 3 bills through the Congress. So then the premium is on the leadership in the meantime to fix all these holes in the dike.
Simple. I don't know if this is overly simple answers to your question, but bring back the FinTIB directive that existed under the Trump administration and make PERA mandatory. Mm-hmm. And for the startup community, right? I think that's a level of predictability that I think could be delivered pretty quickly and efficiently and with a lot of clarity.
The thing that bothers me about the PTAB, and Scott, you and I have had this conversation too. We go. It seems like fundamentally, we were told back in 2008, 9, 10, leading up to this passing, and then we get it passed, is that there's a lot of really bad patents out there that just need to be taken out, need to be fixed, and the numbers of institutions have gone down a little bit, but they're still, even at like 1,400, that's almost 3 times what you predicted. You predicted somewhere between 400 and 500 a year. And at their peak, I think they hit not quite 2,000, but around like 1,900, almost 4 times what you predicted. And it just seems year after year after year after year after year, at the same time that the office has continued to say that examiners have 96, 97, 98% quality. And to me, it's one of those things doesn't make sense. If the patents that are valuable enough to be fighting about in litigation and fighting, spending $500,000 to $1 million to litigate at the PTAB are that questionable across the board, and there's no end in sight, then what's going on? It seems to me that fundamentally from the top down there needs to be some kind of resetting of priorities, and I don't know exactly how to do that within the government scheme. So I'm looking at you, Dave, to see, you've lived this for a long time. You accomplished a lot. How would you go about, if you wanted to try and shake things up, and not to say anybody's not doing, but look, if you're a hammer, the world looks like a nail. If you're a PTAB judge and you're being told, these patents are bad, I would think that some kind of, from somebody to say, hey, maybe reconsider, maybe think about, if in doubt, don't institute type of thing. I mean, does that have influence?
Yeah, I think it really does, and a lot of this goes to the tone that's set at the top. One of the things in the nonprofit that Judge Michelle and I are involved in, and Chris is involved in too, did a study, actually paid an economics outfit to do a study of error rates in the PTO, grant rate errors and denial rate errors. And what they found, this was a surprise to me, is that the PTO makes many more errors denying the grant of patents than it does granting patents that shouldn't be granted. So that's the kind of error that no one seems to talk about, but it's the error that causes the startup not to get funded, right? It's the error that causes the product not to get launched because a patent that should have been granted wasn't granted. So where does that lead in terms of your question, Gene, and the tone at the PTO? If the new leadership starts saying, look, it's important to have quality right in all directions. That means we want to be careful not to grant patents that shouldn't be granted, but we want to expeditiously grant those patents that should be granted and not screw around with extraneous rejections just because we think there's an atmosphere where our job is to deny patents. That's not our job. Our job is to follow the law. And if that tone starts to get set, I think another thing you'll see is the grant rate ticking up, and as it probably should for patents that should get granted, actually getting granted, and that again helps to free examiners up so they can do more constructive work other than just serially, denying applications. And the same thing applies, I think, to the PTAB. If the judges are given a bit more leeway to say, look, if you don't want to look at a case because it already is being looked at a district court, it previously was looked at a district court, it's similar to a case that was looked at whatever, we're going to stand behind you in doing that. I think you're going to see more latitude and more exercise of that kind of discretion.
Yeah, I think one big change that could happen is with the quality supervisors, because it seems like they disproportionately review mistakes that result in a patent being issued, not the mistakes that result in a patent never being issued. And I've also, I hear from a lot of examiners all the time, and maybe in my position I only hear some whistleblowing type complaints, not that we've blown any whistles with this because it's delicate, but all the time I hear from examiners saying that I have to issue rejections. My SPE has told me to, whatever I have to do to come up with whatever rejection, make a rejection. We can't issue things on our first action, even if it's a frivolous rejection, make it. And that has to be because of the quality review people are looking at things. And so that would be one thing. And then on the PTAB, I would love for them to be more discerning. I would also love for the PTAB, and I don't know whether this maybe a rule, maybe a statute, but I would love for the PTAB to be informed by an examiner. And if the examiner who issued the patent is still there, what would be the harm in asking the examiner, what can you help walk us through what you did and why and bring us up to speed? And that examiner should be able to bring them up to speed very quickly. And if not, if the examiner who issued the patent isn't around, somebody from that art unit, just help us go through this, because yeah, the PTAB judges are experienced and expert in that area that they work in, but they're not as experienced and expert in this application as examiners in that art unit are. And I think that would go a long way. And I think you would see the PTAB maybe think twice about instituting, or maybe give more benefit of that. It's hard to criticize. I can tell you this firsthand. It's hard to criticize somebody that you respect and like when they're sitting right there. And I think having an examiner there would temper a lot of things.
If you think of the history of how the AIA got sold to have IPRs at the PTAB, my understanding is a great many members had the expectation that this process would be used for plainly bad patents that needed to be cleared out fast and cheaply and reliably. And the PTAB can do that, and it does do that. But it seems like the PTAB also institutes in cases that are not plainly bad patents, that are very close or maybe good patents, but they get instituted anyway. Why? Well, because the design defect in the statute itself said if one claim in the whole patent likely could be held invalid later, then all challenge claims are up for grabs. That was a terrible mistake, in my opinion, in the legislation. But the cure is to control the front end. One of the things that I consider sort of the signal of trouble is if the panel needs expert help in deciding 103 for a given patent, it shouldn't be in the PTAB to begin with. It was supposed to be, you could tell from the written prior art. That's why the admissible evidence was originally thought to be just prior art documents, and the 3 panel members would look at the prior documents and say, okay, the prior art covers this, it's obvious, you're out, or the opposite. But if you let in cases where you really need expert opinion, you're already in a swamp.
Yeah. Scott, do you have any questions, comments, concerns?
I guess I'd be interested in just going back to mistakes in the AIA, the panel's thoughts on the SAS decision and whether or not that would be some kind of compromise. From my perspective, the way that the system used to work, so you challenge claims 1 through 10, and the PTAB would come along and say, well, we think 1 through 3 are weak, but 4 through 10, we're not going to institute on those. Whether I'm a patent owner or a petitioner, I preferred that system, right? If I'm the patent owner, now I've got 5 claims, I can go back and I can litigate. And if I'm petitioner, well, if I'm going to lose, I'd rather lose now than have the estoppel on the back end. And so I think the consideration at the outset was, well, but that's inefficient if we break up these claims. But it seemed to me to be the better way to run the system, because at least both sides are getting something, and the patent owner can then go back and litigate those claims. But the SAS decision changed that, so just a potential change that maybe made a little more sense to go back to the way that we started.
Any thoughts on that, gentlemen? I mean, that picks up on, I think, what you were just saying, Dave.
Yeah, what I think of as mistakes, 20/20 hindsight in AIA, not putting in from the very beginning a presumption of validity, the same sort of standards as in district court, requirement for clear and convincing evidence, the right standard of proof. And instead, we thought, hoped, and kind of assumed that an examination standard that was hinged on applicants practically being able to amend their claims was the right design approach. And it turned out it just has not worked that way at all. And we got to get over thinking that applicants are going to be able to or willing to amend their claims in most cases, and have a statute, and this is what the PREVAIL Act does, that sets the PTAB up much more like a regular court in terms of the standards and presumptions that it uses. One last thing, and I'll stop. I vividly remember the first meeting. At the time I was there, we were convening in the Madison, the biggest conference room there. All the district court judges, and I think you used to show up, Judge Michaud, you were still on the bench, and federal circuit judges, and we had the tables set up all the way around the perimeter of the room, and you'd look around, and the entire room would be filled with district court judges who were coming to the PTO to spend a couple days with us to learn about patent law, federal circuit judges there. And I remember feeling really flat when during one of the breaks, several of the district court judges came up to me and said, we're not going to give you guys any respect at all for the stuff you're doing with this PTAB because the standards are totally different. We don't even understand whether these are cats or dogs or what the heck they are, right? And at that point I thought, oh boy. This is a problem, and it's continued to be a problem.
So if Yogi Berra said making predictions is difficult, particularly when it's about the future. So I'm going to ask you, though, to try and make some predictions. What do you think the odds are that we will get PERA during this Congress?
We might get it in the next Congress, but I think it's going to take more than a little under 2 years. That's all we got left of this Congress. I think it'll get passed in the next Congress, before the end of the current presidential term. And what the spark plug will be is when China comes out with some astonishing new technology that leaves us helpless, and suddenly everybody on Capitol Hill will be in a panic and they'll do it.
Last night.
Yeah, I mean, crisis does focus the mind.
Yeah.
Dave, you agree?
Yeah, I don't disagree with the judge that it's the odds are going up. Last Congress, I was saying no way. This Congress, I would say the odds are somewhere between low and less than 50%, and the next Congress is probably the one. We'll advance the bill this Congress. I'm hoping we'll get it out of committee this Congress, but these are stepwise processes.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say 50-52. It's just, it's a complicated bill, right? And we are starting not from scratch, but with some new members. There's a House problem on that one too. I mean, we have not gotten the type of traction on the House side on PERA or PREVAIL for that matter. So a lot of work to do there.
But that's where the administration comes in again. If
be
we
hugely
got
helpful.
the office in there helping, the commerce folks in there helping.
If this, I would say this. I mean, this package of bills. I mean, it does come under the perspective from the administration as being something that will be profoundly beneficial for. I mean, they're using the phrase "little tech." I mean, startups, growth tech, right? Lots of different framings for that concept. But I mean, there is a pronounced and public and very, I think, real commitment from the Trump administration to do overt things that will benefit the small, innovation part of our economy. Now, whether they're doing it because they're motivated by, China or to create more jobs, to bring things back to the United States, I mean, I think it's real, and I know it's real. And I think if some of these features of patent reform are viewed as being part of that agenda, I think there's a lot of potential for this administration to lean in, whether that's, from leadership at PTO or from the Commerce Secretary, who'll, be on the Hill on Wednesday having this conversation with senators. I suspect he could get some questions on IP. There's 2 or 3 members on the Commerce
the
Committee,
missing
right?
link is everybody favors small business. You can ask 535
No one
members of
opposes
Congress,
small
do you like
business,
small
right?
business? I love small business. They say, well, then pass this bill. Well, wait a minute. What's the connection? They don't get the connection. That's the missing gap here. And that's why it's so important to do the constant education and all the meeting with staff and members. And we have to keep doing it. We have to do it faster and better than ever. And we will. But I think, as was the case with the AIA, as Dave reminds us, if we don't get some White House and Commerce Secretary high-level support, it's not going to register high enough on the congressional mental Richter scale to get attention and get passed.
And that's the problem too. And everybody's for innovation, but what is innovative to you is different than what's innovative to other people. We have a real language problem, a linguistic problem. I remember one of the first attorneys who really broke me in, and I say that seriously, broke me in as an associate, always told me that the person who wins the linguistic high ground almost always wins the argument. And I feel like in our area, for the same reason, small business, everybody's for small business. Everybody's for innovation. But we seem to have lost what those words mean in the debate. And I think we need to recapture that. And I hope, Judge, you're wrong. I hope it doesn't take some kind of catastrophic national security or economic security event. But I fear that that's where we're headed. That will be what's required to crystallize the mind in Congress.
Well, we may get there faster and better without disaster. But I'm just saying, if that happened, it will definitely pass very fast.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we should wait for that to happen. We should not wait for it to happen.
Yeah.
Gene, just to put a fine point on the missing linguistic link that you're talking about, it's the requirement of invention in order to have innovation. It's the link between the two that members of Congress don't get. They'll all say they're for innovation. They'll all say they're for small growth companies and startups. And then when you start telling them, you know what, you cannot be for those things without also being for a strong and effective patent system, that's the part of the equation they don't get and they need to get.
Right. Absolutely.
I mean, it really comes down to money. Innovation is expensive.
Yeah.
And whether you're talking about attracting venture capital or whether you're talking about convincing CEO of a big company to invest in a new product or some expensive research, they will want to know, well, what are the risks? What are the benefits? How soon? How sure or will we get a profit out of this if we do it? And when you can't tell them because this whole system is so undependable and unpredictable, a lot of those decisions are going to be, no, we're not going to make the investment. Whether it's the VC or the company using the revenue stream, they're not going to do it unless they see it's reliable enough.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I have a very quick observation. I think a lot of people in our industry are trying to run away from where Elon Musk said patents are for the weak and try and fight back on that. And I would say, yeah, you're precisely correct. Patents are for the weak, because if you were the mega giant Google or Apple or any of the Silicon Valley darlings that are worth $500 billion, you don't need patents, but you also don't innovate. I mean, what you need is you need patents if you're a small business who's trying to compete against those established incumbents, and without strong patents, you're never going to get anywhere because you're just going to get crushed. Because you don't own the channels of distribution. You don't own the manufacturing. You don't own the supply chain. You need help from those people that do have those things. And without a strong patent, you have no chance. So patents are precisely. And in the U.S. experience, they were exactly for the weak. 80% of U.S. inventors at the time we had our first Patent Act did not even have a high school education. I mean, these are just the facts. Our system has always been for the weak, precisely because that's where the creative, innovative, inventive thoughts come up.
I would tweak it slightly, and I would say patents are for the young. And we had this conversation. We kind of had this conversation with a lot of staff at the end of last year, and Elon, and we were on the Hill with some biotech companies and some other startups, and they're like, yeah, patents are for the young, right? I mean, patents are for young companies. And
absolutely.
We do all kinds of things across the government and in all kinds of structures to support and nurture young, right? I mean, if you want to kind of look at it that way. So to me, that's like that.
See, and that's a good way to do it,
head,
because
right?
that also addresses sort of maybe the antitrust issue, and like when you get older and big and incumbent, well now, and that may raise its head in this.
I think it's definitely there as part of the conversation. I mean, it makes it a little more complex, but I mean, I'm very encouraged when I see people like Gail Slater being nominated to be the head of the antitrust division at DOJ. And her announcement come along with a tasking mission from the president, go do things to empower. Literally, it says it in her somewhere. In
the tweet. In
the
True
tweet,
Social.
take on big and empower little tech.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, so that to me goes right into this notion of what are we doing for young companies and little tech companies. And I think if you're an antitrust enforcer and you're looking at one of the strongest tools in your toolkit is a well-armed, well-protected intellectual property system that benefits those startups that are trying to disrupt the big guys.
The funny
That's
thing
why
is
it's there.
You wouldn't need antitrust enforcement if you had a strong patent system that let the young compete fairly against the older.
And the irony is so great that all those big tech companies that are fighting patent reform were themselves patent-dependent small startups once.